Okay, guys, so we are continuing now with period 8. We're definitely getting close to the end since we're in the 1970s now. We've already started chapter 38 when we talked about Watergate. And so when I finished the Watergate video, I mentioned that we're going to have our next president after Nixon, Gerald Ford. And so in this video, I'm going to talk about Gerald Ford and his presidency, and then we'll start getting into Jimmy Carter's presidency and his domestic policy. So if you've never really heard of Gerald Ford before, I'm not shocked, but it's kind of weird, right, that there would be a president so recently. Most of your parents were alive during, if not all of your parents were alive during Gerald Ford's administration. Yet he's not really one we talk about, and that's really because he was president for such a short period of time. If you remember, Nixon resigned, and it immediately ushered in this next president in 1974. But new election campaign would be in 1976. So he only had 2 years as president. When he got the office, when he was sworn in, remember, he was not elected vice president. The vice president that ran with Nixon was Spiro Agnew, and he had resigned for a separate corruption scandal. So when Nixon resigned and Ford became president, Ford became the first unelected president in the United States, and in our history we haven't had a situation happen like this. Really, Nixon's the only president we've ever had resign, and it's just so odd that under those circumstances, he had also had an unelected vice president. So sort of a perfect storm of events here. And a lot of people really didn't know who Gerald Ford was when he became president in 1974. If they did, they knew him from his college football career, which had been really successful. Aside from that, he had served in World War II, so he was a veteran. He was a former congressman. But honestly, his presidency was basically worthless. He was not president for any long amount of time to develop a real agenda and start trying to put significant legislation forward. In addition to that, the year he took office, 1974, that November, it was midterm elections for Congress, meaning that a large portion of the House of Representatives and the Senate were up for re-election that year. And that year, only a few months into Ford's presidency, the Republican Party, his party, lost 48 seats in the House of Representatives. And a lot of that was reflective of how Americans were feeling about the Republicans after Nixon and that whole debacle. So people were clearly very unhappy with government in general, but especially Republicans, because Nixon had been a Republican. Similar to what helped Republicans do so well when Johnson was coming out of office. They were unhappy with him, so they were unhappy with Democrats. So we're going to see a lot of this back and forth between parties in this period in terms of who is running things from the White House. Now, the first thing that Gerald Ford did do when he got into office was he issued a pardon for Richard Nixon on any crimes that he may or may not have committed. This confused a lot of people. That made them say, okay, well, does that mean that he did do it? If he needs to be pardoned, was he guilty? It also makes people think, did Gerald Ford basically, make a deal with Nixon and agree, basically, in exchange for the office of vice president, Nixon saying, I'll step down and then you can issue me a pardon? Was this all some big collusion? There were also plenty of other people who felt like this just ends any possibility the country had at closure through the Watergate entire scandal. Just because Nixon resigns doesn't mean that the situation is over, right? He's still subject to potential criminal charges, just not from Congress any longer. And by Ford pardoning him before we could even get real answers on those, it just squashes the whole thing before there could have been any more answers. And Gerald Ford said his reasoning was that the country had been through so much in the last several years, which was very true. If you just think about from 1960 to to 1972, and or even 1964 to 1974, just the last 10 years of what the United States had been through. He was like, we need to put this behind us. So I'm making this decision so that we can move on. But a lot of people felt like it was just shady, and they weren't really happy. And that's, probably something that he had to deal with when it came time to run for president in 2 years. Now, his main domestic agenda was trying to target that stagflation we talked about, that Nixon's going to be trying to overcome and be unsuccessful. Ford will try, Carter will try. It's something we're going to be facing all through the 1970s. And so Ford's stagflation or economic initiative was called WIN, which stood for Whip Inflation Now, and it basically made everything 1,000 times worse. So WIN was a lose, and it ended up making factories start shutting down, and then demand dropped, unemployment actually rose because of this domestic agenda. So the whole thing ended up just being a total flop, and that's really all you need to know about it. It did not reflect well on Ford. As for his foreign policy, there were a couple of important moments here. One is that we're out of the Vietnam War now, and what we're going to see happening, he comes into office in 1974. A few months later, South Vietnam surrenders to North Vietnam, and at that moment, thousands of South Vietnamese refugees will begin to flood into the United States. They were nicknamed boat people by the media because of these shanty homemade rafts and boats that they would put together to migrate here in. This was the largest mass water migration in history, and over the next 20 years, over 1 million people are going to arrive in the United States trying to flee the conflict and the new regime in Vietnam. The next major issue that Ford has to tackle is, of course, going to be the Cold War and what's our relationship like with the Soviet Union. Now, while we were talking about Vietnam, we sort of stopped talking about the Soviet Union and the Cold War. But don't forget that North Vietnam was being aided by the Soviet Union and aided by the Chinese. So it's not as if we were cool with them during those periods. We were just focusing both of us and the Soviets were focusing our energies on Vietnam and using that as like a proxy war. But coming out of Vietnam, we're trying to set an example of we're trying to stay away from military conflict. So Ford did two things. One, he signed the Helsinki Accords, which was an agreement among major world leaders in favor of human rights and how we're going to respect human rights, which was important coming out of a military conflict with so many war crimes on both sides. And then the second thing he did was he signed an agreement with the Soviet Union called SALT II. And the USSR and us are pledging in the SALT II agreement to limit our nuclear weapons production. So it basically puts an end to that arms race, which is awesome because that's definitely not something anyone needs. It just creates more and more tension. So the SALT II agreement was a good thing, and that ended up being pretty positive while it was in place. Unfortunately, none of this was enough for people to feel confident in Ford's administration, and understandably so. It was only, really a year and a half of him being president before it was time to go back to the polls. So in 1976, it's election time, and we've seen the world change quite a lot since our last election in 1972. If you remember, in that election, the entire electoral map was red. Here, I'll go back to it really quick so we can get a look. Right down here, this is when Nixon won. And in just 4 years, the Republicans have lost a lot of the trust that the American people had in them because of the entire, just like scandal situation. Not just Watergate, but, that was one, probably the biggest, but one of several instances that happened during those 4 years. So at the same time, the 70s was a revival of Christian fundamentalism, and we'll talk more about that later on when we get to Reagan's election. But by 1980, 1 in 5 Americans is going to consider themselves a fundamentalist. And if you don't remember what fundamentalism is, that's where you take your religion religious text literally. So this, if you remember, the Scopes monkey trial, that was fundamentalism. And so now we're seeing fundamentalism come back again. And a lot of that had to do with a lot of reasons. One would have been all the chaos of the 60s and 70s. People felt like they wanted to go back to like traditional values and rely on, things that they felt were more dependent than coming out of all this like constant change, which is pretty similar to after World War I. If you think about it, that's when that we see that other big rise in fundamentalism. World War I was definitely a moment of big change for everyone. So we see a big pushback to traditional values when it's over. Similar situation here. The other big reason is that we are seeing the television and media play a huge role, and television has grown so much now that this is how so much of news and ideas are spread. And there's an entirely new category of religion that we're seeing that coming out, and it's televangelists. Evangelicals are people who try and convert people to their like version of Christianity, and televangelists are preachers that do that on television. Definitely the most famous televangelist at the time was a man named Jerry Falwell, and we'll talk more about Falwell later, but other ones would be like Pat Robertson. If you've ever been watching Freeform and fallen asleep and woken up at 2 o'clock in the morning and the 700 Club was on for 4 hours, the old guy who's the anchor for the 700 Club, that is Pat Robertson. And back in the 70s and 80s, he was one of the most popular televangelists around. These guys had millions of viewers every day, and what they are doing is telling their viewers to not only believe in your religious values and support them, but use them to guide your vote. You should be voting with your conscience and vote for a candidate that you feel that holds those same religious and moral values. So this was an important moment in 1976, an opportunity that Democrats really, and when Nixon won, it looked like, will we ever have another Democratic president again? Because Johnson had just really crapped on the party so much. It didn't look like there would be a lot of success afterwards. But through this entire chaos of Nixon and Ford, there's an opening here, and the Democrats are going to seize it. So it was important, who do we nominate against Gerald Ford? And how do we get those voters back? So they went back to targeting the voters that they had before, which was going to be the South and those other liberals. So they targeted cities where a lot of the social change was happening, and they nominated a candidate who was a born-again Christian from the South. They nominate a man named James Carter, who was a born-again Christian and a peanut farmer from Georgia. He had people were feeling very gross about DC. They were like, every politician is grimy and terrible and corrupt. So they nominate this angel man who has zero connections to Washington, D.C. He has the only elected position he's ever had has been governor of Georgia. And he was only governor of Georgia for a few years before this moment. Like I said, other than that, he was a peanut farmer, a backcountry boy who, but he was smart. He had his degrees, and he had enough connections to make people feel like he had experience, but he was distant enough for them to not feel like he was corrupt. And he definitely played that like country Southern charm. I'm a good Christian man, but for me, I'm going to fix America type of shtick, and it worked for him. And as you can see, Nixon had worked so hard to swing the South for Republicans, they immediately lost it here just 4 years later. Not just Georgia, but the whole South goes to Carter and several other states, which is all that he needed. So we'll get into now his domestic policy. Now, really, Carter is much more known for his foreign policy, so there's not much to say for domestic policy, but there are a few things I do want to mention. One is at the start of his presidency in the sort of the same mindset of what Gerald Ford had, which was like, let's leave the turmoil of the 60s and the early 70s behind us, and let's move forward into a more positive light. And so coming out of Vietnam, he saw that as like a very traumatic moment for all of America, and it was. So he really wanted to put Vietnam behind us. So he decided to issue amnesty, and amnesty is a political pardon. He granted amnesty to all of the men who had dodged the draft during the Vietnam War, saying, like, there was a big divide between people who were opposing the war and supporting the war, and even among people opposing the war, how you show your opposition, there are divides there. And so he wanted to heal the country after the war because it was such a sore subject for everyone. But what it did actually was sort of opened up all those wounds again, and lots of fighting happened because of it. People were really angry. Even people who were against the war, there were plenty of them angry about this, because basically what he's saying is that the people who reported to the draft, who got drafted and reported to the draft war and went to Vietnam and did what their country asked them to do and then lost their lives for it, that what they could have done is just broken the law, not gone, stayed at home illegally, and then it would have been granted okay anyway. So it sort of made the deaths of these, 80,000 men very trivial, and people were very angry. Barry Goldwater, if you remember, he ran for president against Lyndon Johnson. He called this the most disgraceful thing a president has ever done. And those are big words, considering we're just coming out of Nixon, who did plenty of disgraceful things, and Johnson, who did plenty of disgraceful things, and Kennedy, who we're finding out more and more about his personal life all the time, also pretty disgraceful. So, and not to mention, the other 30 presidents before him. So to call this the most disgraceful thing a president has ever done, that really shows you how angry plenty of people were about this. But definitely the biggest focus that Carter had during his presidency was the economy and that stagflation that we're going to be dealing with. The economic situation will continue to decline during the late 70s. Foreign companies like Toyota, a Japanese car, are expanding so much that our American car companies like Chrysler need federal loans to stay afloat. Chrysler almost completely went under. The federal government had to bail them out. Carter tried to pass a bill that would encourage oil conservation, because if you remember, we're dealing with the energy crisis and the oil crisis at the same time because of the OPEC embargo. But unfortunately, his own party, remember, he doesn't have any connections to Washington. And while that's good, because you're thinking, cool, he's not going to have he's not going to be corrupt and making all these sleazy deals. You have to have friends in Washington if you want to be able to get things done. You need some people to have your back. There has to be a you scratch my back, I scratch your back type of thing in order to see anything done. And he had no friends. No one cared about Jimmy Carter, even of his own party. By the time they do pass an energy bill, it's not at all like the one Jimmy Carter proposed, and he doesn't really get any credit for it. I remember one of his campaigns, this picture is what made me think of it. One of his campaigns for us to conserve energy was to reduce the use of heating and air conditioning in our home. So his campaign was to put on a sweater. That's literally, that's it. That's the campaign, was put on a sweater. And so there were all these photos of him wearing his cardigan and sitting by the fire where he's not using his heating and saving energy and saving the planet. And people were like, that's ridiculous. That's not a good campaign. That cardigan is in the Smithsonian now, if you ever make it over there. But aside from trying to handle the energy side of this economic crisis, he also is going to nominate a new head to the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve at this time, is basically like the National Bank. It's just not the National Bank. It's the Federal Reserve. So he nominates a new head of the Fed, and his name is Paul Volcker, Volcker. And Paul Volcker got into office and took the stance of raising interest rates as a long-term strategy that would pull the country out of its decline. It ends up working, actually, and we will start to see some financial and economic improvement because of Volcker's work. But unfortunately, whether the interest rates are low or high, you can't leave them in place for too long. They need to constantly fluctuate to match the market. And those interest rates will end up being left in place for too long, and then we'll sort of go back down again. But there was a period of brief reprieve whenever we did see a little bit of success. But on the whole, Carter wasn't really able to see a lot of progress in terms of domestic policy.